is not the loudest presence, but the quietest absence that often speaks the most. In life, we are taught to hold on, to fix, to try harder, but there is a sacred wisdom in walking away, not in anger, not in defeat, but in deep clarity. When a woman withdraws from a relationship where she is no longer valued, it disrupts the familiar patterns. It initiates reflection. It invites remembrance. From a neuroscientific lens, absence heightens dopaminergic longing. From a psychological perspective, it creates emotional differentiation. And from the path of Zen and Shaolin wisdom, it is a form of non-actions, Wu Wei. A quiet, powerful alignment with truth. Not all departures are endings. Some are spiritual realignments. Some are the echo of self, respect speaking louder than words. And this echo, this silence, is why men fall deeply. Not because she left out of spite, but because she left to remember who she is. When a woman withdraws her presence from a relationship, it does not merely mark a change in behavior. It initiates a shift in energy that echoes far deeper than words can convey. In that quiet absence, something unexpected begins to take shape in the mind and heart of a man who once took her for granted. The silence she leaves behind begins to speak, louder, clearer, and with more gravity than all her previous efforts combined. It is within this void that he begins to feel what was previously unnoticed, overlooked, or dismissed. Suddenly, the ordinary becomes extraordinary in hindsight. The moments she cooked for him, the way her energy grounded the room, the subtle way she showed care, even in silence, all come rushing back with clarity and emotional weight. What once seemed mundane now feels sacred. This is not simply about emotional nostalgia or missing a routine. There's something far more primal occurring, rooted deeply in the psychological fabric of human behavior. Neuroscience teaches us that the human brain is wired for contrast. When we lose access to something that once brought us comfort, the brain doesn't just acknowledge its absence, it amplifies its significance. The dopaminergic system, which governs desire and motivation, thrives not on constant availability, but on the anticipation and possibility of reward. When a woman is always present, always giving, always emotionally available, the reward becomes expected. It loses its edge. It becomes background noise in the man's daily life. But when she steps back, not out of manipulation, but out of alignment with her truth, she triggers a psychological contrast that brings everything into sharp focus. There's a reason why artists often discover their deepest inspiration after heartbreak. Why soldiers write their most heartfelt letters, not at home, but from the battlefield. Why people don't truly appreciate breath until it is taken from them. Absence introduces a mirror. It doesn't just reflect the woman who left, it reflects the man he was when she was still there. This is where emotional evolution begins. In one instance, a woman named Amina had spent years nurturing her relationship with gentle persistence. She reminded her partner of his strength during his moments of doubt. She created warmth in their home, remembered the small details of his day, and never withheld her affection. But slowly, she began to notice that her presence had become assumed, not honored. Her warmth was expected, not received. And every time she expressed her needs, she was met with the subtle indifference of someone who no longer listened with curiosity. Instead of reacting with frustration or pleading for change, Amina chose to retreat, not out of anger, but out of awareness. She did not storm out, she simply stopped overextending. She stopped filling silences that were not reciprocated. She allowed the natural space between them to emerge, like a tide receding from the shore. It was in this quiet that her partner began to notice the void her absence created. Not just the absence of her voice, but of her energy. He felt it in the silence of their home, in the way his meals lacked flavor, in the emotional emptiness of spaces that were once filled with connection. Her absence began to illuminate her presence. And this illumination birthed understanding, not just about her, but about himself. It is a paradox of human nature that we often understand value through loss. In psychological terms, this is known as emotional salience, a process by which our attention is drawn more strongly to events that disrupt our emotional norm. When a woman leaves, her sudden emotional absence challenges a man's neurological baseline. It creates a rupture in what was once familiar, and the brain must now reconstruct what it failed to truly appreciate before. This is not a manipulation tactic. It is the reality of contrast shaping cognition. Yet, this kind of impact cannot come from any woman. It must come from a woman who gave fully, who showed up authentically, who loved deeply and lived her truth. Because only then does her absence carry weight. If there was no presence to begin with, her leaving is simply a whisper in the wind. But if she was a source of light, her departure casts a shadow that cannot be ignored. Stillness then becomes her power, not as a weapon, but as a form of sovereignty. In a world that rewards noise, reaction, and over-explanation, the decision not to react becomes an act of inner mastery. This kind of self-regulation is not easy. It requires emotional discipline and deep self-trust. It demands that a woman silence the inner voices that urge her to fix, to prove, to please. Instead, she leans into the quiet, into the stillness that says, "I am enough, even when I do nothing." And in that stillness, she becomes magnetic. True emotional self-regulation is a rare force. It signals maturity. It shows that a woman is not governed by impulse, but by principle. And while many men may not articulate this consciously, they feel it. It creates a gravitational pull that no external beauty can match. Because it is not about appearance, it is about first presency. Consider the story of May, a quiet woman with an unshakable sense of inner peace. Her partner, ambitious and emotionally inconsistent, was often overwhelmed by the speed of his own life. May never chased him. She never pleaded. She simply anchored herself in her own routine, her practices, her stillness. She was warm, but never desperate. Kind, but never compromising her own truth. And when she sensed that her emotional investment was no longer honored, she didn't protest. She stepped away gently and without drama. Her absence struck like thunder, not because she shouted, but because she didn't. Her partner, at first indifferent, soon found himself lost. The sound of her quiet presence, the way she made tea in the morning, the peace she brought into their space was missing. Her absence forced him to confront the noise within himself. For the first time, he realized that her stillness had become his sanctuary, not because she filled a void in him, but because she reminded him of the calm he had long abandoned. This is the silent alchemy of emotional self-regulation. It requires deep self-awareness to recognize when your presence is no longer aligned with mutual respect, and even deeper strength to walk away without seeking validation or attention. It is not indifference, it is clarity. When a woman stops over-giving, stops emotionally rescuing, and instead chooses to trust the silence, something profound begins to happen. Her energy recalibrates, her self-respect expands, and while the man may not understand it immediately, a part of him senses the shift, because energy never lies. In the study of bioenergetics, every human being emits subtle electromagnetic frequencies. These frequencies shift with our emotional states. A woman who operates from a place of self-possession and calm emits a frequency that feels safe yet untouchable. When she removes that frequency from someone's life, it leaves a void. A dissonance that resonates not just emotionally, but physically. The body remembers what the mind cannot explain. Men, especially those who are disconnected from their inner emotional world, often recognize truth not through explanation, but through loss. The absence of the feminine presence is not just emotional, it is existential. It shakes the masculine identity, particularly if that identity was unconsciously built on the silent labor of an emotionally intelligent woman. But the woman must understand, this kind of impact only arises when her leaving is not reactive. It must come from a place of grounded decision, when she leaves without bitterness, when she walks away without closing her heart in anger. She leaves a lasting imprint. Not as a punishment, but as a reflection. She becomes the mirror the man never expected to see himself in. There is a story from an old Eastern tale about a woman who used to sit in a garden every day, watering the same flower that refused to bloom. Years passed. She tended, she spoke gently, she gave warmth. Still, the flower did not bloom. One day, she walked away, not in sadness, but in stillness. A year later, when she returned, the flower had blossomed, not for her, but because of her. Sometimes, growth begins the moment we stop trying to force it. In relationships, the same principle holds true. A man's growth does not always begin when a woman stays. It often begins when she stops over-functioning and returns to herself. When she gives space, when she lets silence teach the lessons words never could. This is why men fall deeply, not just for the woman who stays, but for the woman who knew when to leave. And yet, even in her departure, she remains whole. She is not fragmented by the outcome. Her identity does not rest in whether he returns or not. Her center is within her, and that, above all, is what he begins to crave, not just her affection, but her presence rooted in self-respect. The feminine that does not chase, the woman who does not react, the soul who chooses calm over chaos. She is the quiet storm that awakens a man's heart. Because real love is not about possession, it is about resonance. And sometimes you must leave, not to hurt someone, but to hear yourself again. The wisdom lies not in the leaving itself, but in who you become when you do. And in the stillness that follows, what was once taken for granted becomes impossible to forget. When a woman stops explaining herself, something shifts, not only in how others see her, but in how she inhabits her own presence. It's subtle, like a door quietly closing in the night, yet it resounds deeply in the hearts of those who once relied on her constant reassurance, her endless justifications, her willingness to overextend. There's something undeniably powerful about a woman who no longer needs to convince someone of her worth. She simply walks in it, not loudly, not defiantly, but with the quiet authority of someone who has realized that self-explanation, when unwelcome, is a form of self-betrayal. In relationships, the tendency to over-explain is often born from emotional imbalance or from the deep psychological need to be understood and accepted. Many women, particularly those with a nurturing disposition, seek harmony by making sure their actions are not misunderstood. They want to prevent conflict, smooth over tension, and offer context for every feeling or boundary they express. But there comes a point when these explanations no longer serve connection. They become performance. They drain energy. They become the tether that binds a woman to a role rather than to her truth. Modern psychology recognizes this in the framework of emotional codependency. Codependency isn't merely about depending on someone else for validation. It's about over-functioning in an attempt to maintain peace, approval, or connection. The woman explains herself constantly because, at a deeper level, she fears that if she doesn't, she will be misjudged, rejected, or unloved. This fear is not weakness. It often arises from trauma, from cultural conditioning, from being taught that worth must be proven rather than known. But something remarkable happens when that same woman reaches emotional clarity. She realizes that explaining herself to someone who is committed to misunderstanding her is a futile offering. She recognizes that silence can sometimes hold more truth than words ever could. And so she stops, not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of peace. This peace becomes a mirror. And for the man who once relied on her endless words, who felt comforted by the predictability of her explanations, that mirror becomes hard to face. He begins to notice what her silence exposes, his own inability to listen, his dismissal of her needs, the imbalance in their emotional exchange. And slowly, something stirs in him. He may not say it, but he begins to feel the weight of her absence in conversation. Her energy no longer flows toward him uninvited, and that shift alters the emotional ecosystem between them. There's a story of a woman who once shared every detail of her life with her partner. She explained why she was late, why she felt hurt, why she wanted something different. At first, he responded, sometimes dismissively, sometimes distractedly. Over time, she realized that no amount of explanation was changing the depth of connection. So, she decided to stop justifying. She simply acted from her truth, quietly, respectfully, and with grace. She still communicated, but without the urge to seek approval. Her boundaries became firmer, her gaze clearer. And what shocked her partner was not what she said, but what she didn't say. Her silence spoke volumes. It created space for reflection. And in that space, he saw her not as a voice to be managed, but as a woman to be respected. Eastern philosophy often teaches that clarity does not require elaboration. The bamboo does not justify its growth. The river does not explain its path. It simply flows, adapting to the landscape, while staying true to its direction. Similarly, a woman who stops explaining herself is not becoming cold. She is becoming clear. Clarity frightens those who benefit from confusion, but it attracts those who honor truth. From a neurological perspective, this behavior aligns with the shift from reactive to regulated responses. When the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, is engaged, a person can respond rather than react. The woman who ceases to explain herself excessively is often operating from a place of prefrontal maturity. She is not seeking to win, to defend, or to convince. She is aligned internally, and that alignment becomes magnetizing. Men are often not used to this kind of self-possession. In a world where many interactions are transactional, where emotional overextension is normalized, meeting someone who is anchored in herself without demanding recognition can be disarming. It forces a reconsideration. It awakens dormant respect, and in many cases, it draws a man in deeper than any words could. The power of emotional boundaries cannot be overstated. One woman, for instance, was constantly explaining to her partner why she needed more presence, more affection, more attentiveness. He listened, nodded, but changed little. She would rephrase her requests, soften her tone, even apologize for wanting more. Then one day, she simply stopped. She didn't threaten. She didn't make dramatic exits. She just stopped giving her energy to those conversations. Instead, she gave it to herself. She became more radiant. She started spending more time with people who heard her without needing explanations. And slowly, her partner began to change, not because she asked him to, but because he felt the vacuum her silence created. There is an ancient saying, when the flower blooms, the bees come uninvited. The woman who stops explaining and begins embodying her truth becomes like that flower. She blooms, not for validation, but because blooming is her nature. And when she does, she becomes irresistible. Not because she is performing, but because she is aligned. The shift continues when a woman chooses to no longer react emotionally to neglect. This is one of the most misunderstood, yet profoundly transformative inner decisions a woman can make. Emotional reaction is often a sign of engagement. It signals that someone or something still holds power over your emotional world. When a woman begins to detach emotionally from neglect, she is not becoming indifferent. she is reclaiming sovereignty over her inner state. Neglect in relationships often doesn't start as overt cruelty. It begins quietly. A missed call, a forgotten promise, a delayed response. And because women are deeply relational beings, many will initially respond by trying harder, sending longer messages, expressing hurt, requesting presence. But what happens when those expressions are met with continued indifference? For many, the next step is escalation. More pleading, more emotion, more effort. And this is where the cycle deepens. Psychologically, this taps into the concept of intermittent reinforcement. The brain becomes addicted not to love, but to the possibility of love. Just enough attention is given to keep hope alive, but not enough to nourish the soul. The woman becomes caught in a loop, oscillating between hope and disappointment. Her emotions rise and fall with his sporadic efforts. She begins to equate her worth with his attention. But the moment she decides to stop reacting, to no longer allow neglect to define her emotional state, she breaks the loop. And that break is powerful, not because it punishes the man, but because it frees her. She reclaims her emotional energy. She begins to see clearly. And from that clarity comes strength. This strength, again, does not come with fanfare. It's in the quiet refusal to chase, the calm redirection of energy, the decision to be unavailable for confusion. She no longer needs to express how much she's hurting to someone who isn't listening. Instead, she listens to herself, and that listening becomes healing. A man begins to notice this change not always with words, but with a feeling. The woman who once reacted passionately to every neglectful moment now meets it with stillness. Not the stillness of resignation, but the stillness of discernment. She sees, she understands, but she no longer chooses to participate in the pattern. This non-reactivity is often the moment a man wakes up, because her emotional withdrawal is not laced with resentment. It is cloaked in dignity. It is the absence of drama that catches his attention. It is the peace she carries that makes him wonder what he lost while she was trying to hold them together. The story of Maya, a woman in her 40s, illustrates this beautifully. After years in a relationship where her needs were consistently sidelined, she decided to stop reacting. No more emotional appeals, no more tears over unmet promises. Instead, she invested in her well-being. She joined a book club, traveled with friends, and reconnected with her passion for painting. She was no longer emotionally available for neglect. Her partner, initially indifferent, began to sense her shift. At first, he thought it was just a phase. Then he realized she had grown beyond the version of herself who tolerated emotional starvation. And that realization hit harder than any argument could have. This change is not easy. It requires deep self-awareness, emotional discipline, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. It means facing the fear that if you stop reacting, the other person may never change. But it also means trusting that your peace is more important than their potential. A woman who no longer reacts to neglect is not unfeeling. She is wise. She understands that emotional energy is sacred, that her attention is a gift, and that anyone who cannot honor it does not deserve to shape her emotional climate. This shift in behavior mirrors the wisdom of martial arts. The master does not react to every provocation. He moves only when it is necessary, with intention, with precision. So too, a woman can become a master of her emotional energy, not suppressing it, but directing it, not withholding it out of spite, but preserving it out of self-respect. In that preservation, she becomes deeply attractive. Not because she is playing games, but because she is vibrating at a higher frequency of self-regard. The man begins to see that what he once neglected was not just a woman, but a force of grace and depth. And for many, this becomes the catalyst for transformation, not in her, but in him. The beauty of this path is that it does not require confrontation. It does not demand an audience. It is an inner shift, a return to stillness, to centeredness, to truth. And from that place, everything changes, without effort, without noise, only clarity, only presence, only power. There are moments in life when silence becomes the greatest teacher. A moment when a woman walks away, not with loud accusations or dramatic farewells, but with the quiet finality of someone who has nothing left to prove. She does not leave to wound. She leaves because she has exhausted every sincere attempt to be seen, to be valued, to be heard. In that still exit, she speaks the clearest truth, and ironically, it is only then that many men begin to hear her for the very first time. This is the paradox that sits heavy on the hearts of those who have loved too late. It is not always cruelty that destroys a connection. Often, it is neglect in its softest form. The forgetting, the overlooking, the passive ignoring of someone who once offered themselves openly. When that woman is gone, the absence does not simply signify a missing person. It reveals a presence that was never properly acknowledged. In psychological terms, this moment of loss becomes a gateway to regret, and regret is a potent motivator. It does not speak in logic, it speaks in memory. Regret is the heart's way of processing what the mind dismissed. It operates through a sequence of realizations that come too late. I should have listened more. I should have taken her words seriously. I thought she would always be there. These thoughts arrive not while she is pleading for attention, but when the chair she used to sit in is now empty. The cup she once placed on the table is untouched. The room feels colder, not because the temperature has changed, but because the energy that warmed it has departed. This moment is when understanding finally begins, not in theory, but in emotional impact. The mind begins to replay scenes, not because it chooses to, but because it must. Memory becomes a mirror. Every time he remembers her laughter, the way she used to gently check in during his most stressful days, or the quiet way she supported his dreams without demanding applause. Those memories no longer comfort, they haunt. And this haunting is not cruel, it is instructive. It teaches the hard truth: consistency cannot be recognized without contrast. A man who takes a woman's love for granted often does, so not because he is malicious, but because he is unconscious. He has not yet learned to notice the sacred in the ordinary. He sees her messages as routine, her affection as expected, her presence as convenient, until she is no longer there. And then he begins to understand. Every message was a gift, every gesture a form of care, every word a doorway to emotional safety. What was once background music becomes a symphony he can no longer hear. This phenomenon is backed by how the human brain responds to pattern disruption. The absence of something familiar activates the brain's reticular activating system, the filter that determines what is worthy of attention. When the woman was present every day, her emotional labor was filtered out as normal. But when her presence vanishes, the brain scrambles to make sense of what changed. Suddenly, every small detail becomes significant. This neurological response explains why regret is not immediate. It is delayed until the contrast becomes sharp enough to penetrate the filters we live by. Consider the story of Talia, a woman who supported her partner through every season of his growth. She never needed him to be perfect, only present. She celebrated his small wins, stayed up late listening to his concerns, and gave love freely without keeping score. But over time, she began to feel invisible. He was distracted, increasingly unavailable, and slowly, her efforts were met with half-hearted acknowledgements or complete oversight. She spoke up, gently at first, then more directly. Still, little changed, so she decided to leave, not in anger, but in finality. She packed her things quietly. She left a note that didn't blame, but expressed truth. and then she disappeared from his daily rhythm. At first, he felt relief. No more emotional pressure, no more expectations. He mistook her absence for freedom, but freedom without meaning is empty. Within a few weeks, he began to notice things he never paid attention to before. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. Meals felt tasteless. The warmth of her voice no longer greeted him at the door. One morning, he found a small drawing she had left in his drawer, a sketch she had done of the two of them on a bench by the lake. In that moment, the memories returned not just as images, but as emotions. The feeling of her hand in his, the way she leaned into him when she laughed. The conversations that once annoyed him now seemed like sacred exchanges. And for the first time, he cried, not because she left, but because he finally saw what he never truly appreciated while she was still there. This kind of regret does not lead everyone to transformation, but it opens the door. It invites reflection, humility, and sometimes healing. Regret becomes the internal teacher that failure could never replace. For the man who is willing to learn, it becomes the catalyst for emotional maturity. He may not be able to return to the relationship, but he begins to understand love differently. He becomes more present in his future connections. He listens deeper. He recognizes the value of presence before it becomes a memory. There is an old saying, the deepest lessons are written in the ink of loss. What we lose often holds the key to what we most needed to learn. And in relationships, those lessons are rarely about grand gestures. They are about consistency, attentiveness, and gratitude for the quiet ways love is expressed. A woman's love is rarely loud. It is in the way she asks if you've eaten, in the way she notices your mood before you speak, in the way she adjusts her world to make space for yours. When that love is ignored, she does not always fight. Sometimes she simply leaves. And that departure is the loudest message of all. The emotional weight of that message is measured not in how she left, but in who she was while she stayed. If she was erratic, manipulative, or absent herself, her leaving may not leave a mark. But if she showed up with integrity, if she gave consistently, if she loved with both vulnerability and strength, her departure becomes a turning point in the life of the man she left. It pierces his assumptions. It forces him to question not only how he treated her, but who he was in the relationship. This confrontation is uncomfortable. It dismantles pride. It dissolves illusions. And yet it is necessary, because real growth does not happen through comfort. It happens through awareness. Regret is the beginning of that awareness. It is the echo of choices once made carelessly. And if received with humility, it becomes a seed of wisdom. Some men try to numb it. They distract themselves with new relationships, hobbies, or the noise of daily life. But unresolved regret has a way of lingering. It visits in quiet moments, in songs she used to hum, in photos that resurface, in conversations where her name slips out. These are not punishments, they are reminders. And for the emotionally awake, they are sacred opportunities to reflect. This is why pain can be a portal, not to despair, but to depth. The discomfort of missing someone you once overlooked is not a curse. It is the first step toward becoming someone who no longer needs to repeat the same mistake. This is not about romanticizing loss, but about recognizing that some truths only become visible when the one who carried them is gone. In the silence that follows a meaningful departure, many men come face to face with the version of themselves they had hidden behind avoidance. The man who never learned to say thank you, who withheld appreciation out of pride, who treated stability as boredom, he begins to dissolve. In his place, a more honest man may emerge, one who now understands that love is not sustained by intensity, but by attention. That the little things are the big things. That affection should never be assumed. and that no one, no matter how strong, stays forever if they are constantly poured from without being filled. There is wisdom in loss, but only if we are willing to sit with it, to feel it fully, to let it burn away the layers of entitlement and emotional laziness, because it is only in that fire that something pure can be forged. The kind of man who no longer fears vulnerability, who no longer takes kindness for granted, who no longer waits until it's too late to say, I see you, I value you, I choose you. And while that transformation may not bring the lost woman back, it becomes a sacred offering to the next chapter. A man reborn in awareness does not forget. He carries the lessons forward. He loves better. He listens more. He shows up, not because he is afraid to lose again, but because he has finally understood what it means to truly have something worth holding. There is no shame in regret, only in refusing to learn from it. When a woman leaves and her absence becomes the teacher, the wise man listens, not to punish himself, but to evolve. Because sometimes love's greatest lesson arrives not in her presence, but in the echo of her absence. And in that echo, the heart hears what it was deaf to before, the sacredness of someone who loved quietly, deeply, and enough to walk away when she was no longer received with reverence. There is a silent strength in a woman who walks away, not from anger, not from pride, but from the realization that she can no longer thrive in a space where her worth is overlooked. This kind of departure is not loud. It does not come with accusations or ultimatums. It arrives like the wind that carries away the final leaf of a tree in autumn, gentle, inevitable, and full of unseen force. What many do not realize is that when a woman leaves with grace and self-respect, she doesn't just exit a relationship. She steps into a higher state of being, and that shift in her energy does something unexpected. It activates a deep response in the man who once had access to her soul. To understand why this happens, we must begin not in romance, but in the realm of presence and perception. Every human being emits an emotional frequency. Some call it energy. Others describe it as a kind of resonance. You can feel it when someone walks into a room and immediately shifts the atmosphere without saying a word. It's not about physical beauty, wealth, or charm. It's about alignment, when a person's inner clarity radiates outward like a clear, still lake. Now imagine a woman who has worked through her inner wounds, who no longer needs someone to validate her, but rather holds space within herself that is grounded, loving, and firm. When this kind of woman leaves a relationship that does not meet her frequency, her absence becomes more powerful than her presence ever was. Psychologically, this reaction is connected to a mechanism called pattern interruption. When a behavior or presence we've taken for granted is suddenly removed, the brain experiences dissonance. It's as if the music stopped mid-song. The mind, especially in men who may not have yet understood the depth of what they had, is forced into reflection. But this reflection is not about guilt or shame at first. It's about an energy void that is impossible to replace. You see, when a woman walks away with peace in her heart and stillness in her mind, she disrupts a pattern. And this interruption doesn't leave behind noise. It leaves behind a silence that echoes. There is a story often told in Zen traditions of a man who visited a wise teacher asking to be shown the meaning of love. Instead of offering a lecture, the teacher handed him a delicate ceramic cup. "This cup is yours to hold," the master said. The man held it gently. "What does it represent?" he asked. The teacher replied, "The relationship you are in now. It's whole, beautiful, and held with care. Now drop it." The man hesitated, but followed the instruction. The cup shattered. The master looked into the man's eyes and said, "Only when you understand the sound of this silence can you begin to know what you had done." The lesson is simple: absence sharpens awareness. The deeper the connection, the more significant the silence becomes when it vanishes. A man may not realize how deeply he was emotionally fed by the quiet strength, daily encouragement, and emotional safety a woman provided, until those things are gone, and when she leaves with emotional maturity, with no blame, only truth, something profound happens. He begins to see her not as a person, but as a presence, one that cannot be duplicated by mere proximity or physical replacement. Many women mistakenly believe they must become louder to be heard, but in truth, the most potent power they hold lies in dignified withdrawal, not the kind motivated by games or punishment, but the kind born from deep inner knowing. This space no longer serves my growth. When she walks away for the sake of her own alignment, not as retaliation, but as restoration, she enters into her own center. And from that place, something extraordinary radiates sovereignty. It's this sovereignty, this unwavering inner compass that men often fall deeply for, not in the moment of her laughter or the rhythm of shared conversations, but in the gravity of her absence. She is no longer a memory of good times. She becomes a question that lingers, a mirror that reflects back to him not only who she was, but who he was in her presence, and who he failed to become. This reflection often births longing, but more importantly, it gives rise to awareness. And awareness is the seed of transformation. Some men rise from that space, humbled and awakened. Others retreat into regret. But in both cases, her leaving has created motion, a ripple in the still pond of complacency. The strength to leave with clarity and to stay gone with integrity is one of the most underappreciated forms of emotional intelligence. It requires a discipline that does not shout, "You lost me," but simply walks with quiet grace, trusting that self-honoring choices never go unrewarded by the universe. It is not about revenge. It is not about proving anything. It is about knowing that real connection cannot be forced, and real love does not beg to be seen. It reveals itself in its absence. A friend once shared the story of his mother who, after 25 years in a marriage where she felt emotionally invisible, decided to walk away. There was no scandal, no betrayal, just an enduring ache of being unseen. For years, she had spoken softly, served her family, held the home together with grace, but her emotional needs were met with indifference. When she left without anger. She simply told her husband, "I can no longer live in a space where I have to keep shrinking to be accepted." It took her absence 6 months to awaken him to a truth that years of her presence had failed to convey. He wrote her letters. He attended therapy. He started to peel back the layers of his own emotional numbness. But by then, she had stepped into a life that no longer required his approval. What did she gain? Not a dramatic revenge arc, not a bitter sense of justice. She gained herself, and in gaining herself, she became more radiant, more grounded, and ironically, more desirable. This is the paradox. When a woman fully inhabits her own life, she becomes magnetic not through effort, but through essence. And it is this essence that haunts the hearts of men who realize too late what they lost. Biologically, humans are wired to respond to loss more strongly than gain, a principle known in behavioral economics as loss aversion. Applied to relationships, this explains why the void left by a high-value woman often feels unbearable. It's not just about the loss of her companionship, but the realization that what she brought into his life was irreplaceable because it was rooted in authenticity. Her peace, her kindness, her belief in him, all of it was real, and now it is gone. But this isn't merely about regret. It is about transformation. Because some men, when faced with such a loss, begin a journey inward. The silence forces them to listen. The absence forces them to look at themselves, not just at what they did, but who they were. And it is in this sacred discomfort that change begins. Real love does not rescue. It reflects. A woman who walks away teaches not through lectures, but through presence. And then through absence. Her leaving becomes the final truth. It speaks. I loved you enough to stay, but I loved myself enough to go. In traditional Eastern thought, there's a teaching that says, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. But sometimes the teacher leaves, and the absence itself becomes the lesson. This is the journey of a woman who exits a relationship not to punish, but to protect her soul. In doing so, she teaches the man not what love looks like, but what it feels like when it is gone. What often makes this so powerful is that she doesn't chase. She doesn't look back. She doesn't send messages hoping to be noticed again. She has shifted her frequency, and therefore, she no longer vibrates on the same plane. And when a man reaches for her again, energetically or emotionally, he finds that she is no longer there, not in bitterness, but in evolution. In time, some women do reconnect, but only from a new place. Not as the woman who was once misunderstood, but as the woman who now understands herself so deeply that she can no longer engage in dynamics that require her to diminish her light. This is why men fall deeply, not for the woman who left in anger, but for the woman who left in awareness. Her departure becomes a turning point, not just for him, but for her. It is not a moment of ending. It is a moment of awakening. And once awakened, there is no going back to sleep. In the journey of relationships, it's easy to believe that love alone is enough to sustain what was once beautiful. But love, when not nourished with presence, respect, and awareness, begins to fracture, quietly at first, then irreversibly. What we often overlook is that the most powerful revelations don't arrive in the noise of arguments or the weight of ultimatums. They arrive in silence, in distance, in the absence of the one we assumed would always be there. And when a woman chooses herself, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of deep self-alignment, she teaches the greatest lesson, that true connection cannot be negotiated with convenience. It must be recognized, honored, and matched in energy. Her grace in walking away becomes the mirror. Her stillness becomes the echo. Her absence becomes the awakening. And in that awakening, the choice is clear for both. Evolve or repeat, heal or lose again. But no longer can love survive where presence is missing, where effort is one-sided, and where respect is delayed until it's too late. Because the woman who lives in peace never returns as the same version you once knew. She rises, and she rises for good.